Now, the rate of car clocking in Ireland has been steadily increasing since the onset of the recession, with almost twice as many cars affected in Ireland than in, say, the UK. Vehicle history check expert Cartell.ie has long campaigned for the introduction of car clocking as an offence. Jeff Aherne is the director of Cartell.ie and he joins us now. Good morning, Jeff. You're very welcome. OK, let's not assume that everybody knows what car clocking is. So what is it and why is it so wrong in your opinion?
Well, car clocking,
why is it dangerous?
Yeah, car clocking is turning back the odometer of the vehicle. So the odometer is where you read your mileage, your kilometres. And what happens is if somebody does a certain amount of mileage, they clock the car back and then they sell it to you with less mileage than the car has actually travelled.
OK, I would have thought with a lot of modern cars now effectively being computer controlled that would be harder to do. It's
a lot easier to do now because there's software where you can go into the brain of the car essentially with a laptop and you can just change it. So it's actually easier to do now than it ever was.
Right, so therefore it becomes even more of a problem. Yeah. Why is it dangerous?
Well, it's dangerous because if you buy a car and you think there's a certain amount of mileage on the vehicle, but in actual fact it's travelled more, you can miss service intervals. One of the big things would be a timing belt, for example. Now, a timing belt failure may not cause an accident, but what it could do is put you in a predicament that may cause an accident. So, for example, if the timing belt went on a motorway and you're on the fast lane of the motorway, you've got to get across to the hard shoulder. And that's the kind of dangers that we can see with non-servicing of vehicles. OK. What's the legal situation with car clocking? If you've been found to be doing it, what are the penalties? Well, the penalties up to date have just been fines, and it's been very, very difficult to prove. And what's happening now is there's new legislation coming that we've been campaigning for a long, long time. And the legislation will mean that it will be an offence to touch the odometer of a vehicle. See, at the moment you can go near the odometer of a vehicle and it's not an offence. There was some consumer...
These not sealed units?
Well, they are sealed units, but these guys just know how to get around them. And they were advertising the back of papers and car magazines.
And when they're sealed, are they sealed by weights and measures or by customs or whatever? So I understood that where certain vehicles are concerned, that there's a statutory or an official seal on it, and if it's touched by anybody else other than those, then you're in trouble.
No,
not in the case.
No, not in the case of cars, because to be fair, other garages, normal garages, have to be able to access the brain of the car for servicing. So therefore, they can be accessed. There are footprints left. So, for example, in a BMW, there's multiple places around the car where the mileage is stored. So, for example, in the key and the key reader. So, you may have been forced to buy a vehicle and bring it to a BMW dealer. Let's say you bought it outside the network, and that key is read, and then you get the bad news that, well, actually, the last time this car was in here, it had higher mileage than what's currently on it today.
OK, now clocking. I suppose there's a range of offensiveness about clocking, i.e. you can buy a car that you think has 70,000 kilometres on it, but in actual fact it has 100,000 kilometres on it. Now, that means there's more wear and tear. It may not necessarily mean that the car has deteriorated hugely, but there's also the problem of crashed cars, written off cars, and that also comes loosely under the broad umbrella of clocking. Now, you maintain, and I'd like to know where you got this information, that you think that at least 6 or 7 people die in Ireland as a result of crashed cars going back out, or written off cars going back out onto the road. So how do you know that, and how do you prove it, or how do you stand it up? Yeah,
well, Cartell have access to insurance information, insurance write-off information, just like they do in the UK. And we built a database called the Motor Insurers Anti-Fraud and Theft Register. So what we're able to do is we're able to determine how many write-offs exist in the fleet. Every year there's about 40,000 write-offs, of which about a third go off the road because they're just not repairable at all. There's nothing left as a shell. But the rest of them do. So 2/3 go into the fleet every year. And the life cycle of a car is about 12 years. So at any one time there's up to 200,000 write-offs just travelling in the fleet. And most people don't know that they're in a write-off. And of course, the statistics bear there's over 100 people killed in cars every year, and it's unfortunately people will be killed in these cars because they're travelling in the fleet. It may not be the reason for their death, absolutely not, but they're in those cars. And unfortunately, and how we brought this to the fore, because in England, the coroner, a young girl was killed in a car write-off, and it wasn't repaired properly, and she was hit side on, and the coroner stood up above the parapet in England and said, listen, this is a major problem. So even though the systems were there, he said, no, we need to inspect these cars after write-off.
Right. If a car is involved in an accident of sufficient severity or impact that it is written off, the police must know about it, the insurers must know about it. So surely it should be impossible for that car to go back out on the road, shouldn't it?
But the problem is, again, there was no legislation. So when Cartell.ie came on the scene in 2006, we wrote to the government in 2007 and told them there's nothing covering this. So around 2007, the government asked the insurers to send the information, but they only asked. So there's gaps in that data that's been sent, and it didn't cover all the write-offs. So what's happening now is the Minister has moved to say, well, actually, do you know what? To protect people, we're going to make sure that the insurers have to, or somebody, whoever the Minister will decide, once a car is written off, that information has to be sent to the government. It'll be locked down until it's repaired.
But I mean, isn't that like, either if the car's written off, it's written off because it shouldn't be on the road. Now, either it shouldn't be on the road or it should. It's a bit like the little bit pregnant argument. I mean, you can't be. If it's written off, it should never be on the road again. So how does it get back on the road?
Well, there's different categories. There's A, B, C and D. So A would be a burnout you'd see in a shell, so in a field somewhere, a stolen car or something. B would be a really, really bad accident, heavy impact at the front, probably fatalities, maybe bad injuries. But the back of the car, some of the parts can be used, so they say it's a category B. Category C would be a heavily damaged car, but repairable. So a lot of cars, they would class as repairable. Insurer writes a car off because of value and says, listen, if it may not be able to be repaired for an A and B, but if it is repairable, he'll say, look, 60-70% of the value of the car will be spent on repairing this vehicle. So they say it's not economically viable to repair it. But don't forget, you could have airbags deployed in this vehicle. There could be major damage. So what happens is they get sold into the wilderness and people repair these cars. Now, we've seen cars without airbags. Airbags are expensive. So if you imagine the insurers have said, we don't repair this vehicle using proper facilities, genuine parts, times, everything. So they send it into the wilderness and somebody else buys this car and repairs it. And that's not covered. Anybody can buy a salvage vehicle and give it a go.
Of course, one of the big problems is that an awful lot of these cars, in fact, the vast majority of these, I suspect, are sold outside the dealer network. And a question for you, just before we get to sort of do's and don'ts, is why, given that cars are lethal weapons, catastrophically lethal weapons, as we know all too well, why are they allowed to be sold by people who aren't vetted and licensed by some form of state authority?
Globally, I think it's the case. If you look at the UK, it's something similar. Well, we don't know why that would be the case, why the government haven't moved to do something like that. But what we would say is buy off a reputable dealer. As much as you can, buy off a reputable dealer.
Okay, very quickly, we have a graphic there, and I just have some advice that you would give for people. Right, run a car history check, which is not hard to do.
No. Cartell.ie were the first in Ireland, but there are others doing it as well. You can go online and check.
Okay. There has to be a full service and NCT history. There has to be. And if somebody can't provide it for you, just say, sorry, I'm not. Because you're not just risking your life and your family's life, you're risking the life of everybody else who's on the road with you, should something go wrong with the car at the time. Yeah,
and just because it says service history, don't take that for granted, because you can buy service history.
Okay.
So what I would do is ring the garage, the last garage where it was serviced.
All right, obviously take the vehicle for a thorough test and look out for wear and tear. But if you can't, we'll put that up on our Facebook and website a little later on. But as a one-stop shop in terms of knowing what to do, Cartell.ie will point you in the right direction.
Absolutely.
Jeff, thank you very much.